Members of the jury, thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm very disappointed to be described merely as the chair. I thought of myself as the Right Honourable Lord Justice Robinson here today. I asked for a gown, I asked for a wig, but sadly they were not available. Can I just say at the outset, I've got a little bit of a cold, so forgive a slightly crusty sound to the voice. Forgive me for that. That does not mean that you should not be a lively and engaged audience. But can I also say to you that as well as being lively and engaged, you're here to hear the people on stage. So however strongly you feel in disagreement with what they say, you will have lots of opportunity to raise a point or to ask a question later. I mean, I'm sure they'd be delighted if you clapped, cheered a little, even sort of tutted a little, but don't shout out, because everybody else wants to hear what these people who've given up their time tonight have to say. You will, of course, have the chance to vote. So just to remind you before we go in, you have already had a chance to vote, and what we're interested in particular is whether minds have been changed tonight rather than prejudices confirmed. This is the card that I will get you to vote on later, and I will explain to you exactly how we do that. We are essentially going to hear from our two key proponents tonight for the prosecution and for the defence, and then from a series of 4 witnesses. So let me introduce you to them, and then we'll get going with our trial. Remember that what is on trial is not merely the man, Tony Blair, on trial, but a proposition. Tony Blair was a blight on Britain, which is a tricky subject for me to be chairing, given that I will be interviewing a man called Tony Blair tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. So I've been spending the whole time here wondering what I say to him, saying, what are you doing these days? As he is likely to be doing. So, bringing the charge against Blair, Tom Bower. Why is he doing it? Well, because, of course, he's just published a book, Broken Vows, Tony Blair and the Tragedy of Britain. As you will know, though, he is one of Britain's leading investigative journalists and prides himself in producing unflinching biographies of Robert Maxwell, Mohammed Fayed, Gordon Brown, Richard Branson and Conrad Black. Interesting word that, unflinching, means he says the things they don't want to hear. Defending Tony Blair today, David Aaronovitch, who is author of another book, not strictly related to this, but a damn good book it is too, and you can buy it afterwards. Party Animals, My Family and Other Communists. David is, of course, one of Britain's leading columnists and journalists. I declare an interest. He was my first editor in television as well. And there will be other books of his on sale as well, outside afterwards. We're going to hear from both of them, and we're going to get you to vote, as I said. And to bolster their case, they have expert witnesses here. So, from the left, a witness for the prosecution will be Professor Margaret Brown, who's Emeritus Professor of Mathematics Education at King's College London. Next to her, Michael Clarke, Director General of RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, up until last year. Next to him, Matthew Taylor, Chief Executive now of the RSA, but a Downing Street advisor to Tony Blair for many years. And finally, John McTernan, Tony Blair's Director of Political Operation for quite a few years as well. But let us get straight on with the trial itself. And to start with, we are going to make the case, hear the case made for the prosecution against Tony Blair. Tom Bower is going to have 10 minutes, and my high-tech device will be throughout. Can you hear this? No. Right. 1 ping means you've got a minute left, or in the witness's case, 30 seconds. 2 minutes means wrap up, or technically, shut up now and sit down because you're over your time. Tom Bower, would you care to make the prosecution case against Tony Blair?
Good evening. In May '97, Tony Blair was supremely popular. Britons wanted change. His charming personality and promise to be purer than pure, whiter than white, was a relief from the fractious, sleazy Tory regime. Now, nearly 20 years later, we want to understand what went wrong. How come that virtuous character is a derided carpetbagger? Were we all fooled at the outset by a brilliant actor, or did an honest hero fall victim to the temptations of power? Did he embark on government in bad faith, or, infected by vanity and uncertain values, did he lose his way? For a start, the mistake made by the electorate was thinking that Blair arrived in Downing Street with a programme for government. He didn't. Despite all his promises, he had devoted his energy to winning the election and ignored largely what would follow victory. But after a decade in power, he complained that he pulled the levers and nothing happened. He blamed the civil servants' incompetence, and they in turn blamed his ignorance about the skills of management and about his ignorance of history. For Blair, a man blessed with intelligence and remarkable communication skills, was also frighteningly uneducated. Instead of crunching detail, Blair prided himself about relying on what he called instinct and belief. "I only know what I believe," he once said, revealing his misunderstanding of governance and so much more. And so, in the brief moments I have, we get to the heart of the problem. Blair's inheritance in '97 was a growing economy, control over immigration, a widespread trust of Britain's robust institutions, but undoubtedly an underfunded NHS and education system. Yet over the previous 18 years, the Tories had developed, by trial and error, schemes to improve the NHS and education, to defeat what Blair himself would later call the forces of conservatism within those professions. And their solution was to give patients and parents choice, and by encouraging competition amongst schools and hospitals, get better service for British citizens. Blair abolished those delicate beginnings. He introduced targets, performance indicators, and in turn cheating on the back of vast expenditure. Of course, there were substantial improvements in the NHS, but not commensurate with a 300% increase in the budget. Billions were poured into the NHS and productivity declined. Doctors and nurses got huge pay increases, but worked less hours. Unlike Thatcher, Blair was never heard to say, "I want my money well spent." By 2001, Blair realized the Tories had been right and tried to reintroduce thereafter choice and competition. The result was expensive and chaotic. In education, it was the same. The Tories' numeracy and literacy hours for primary school children were genuinely improving standards. Labour kept the headlines, but imposed on teachers targets and told them how to teach. As a result, 11-year-olds were taught how to pass tests, but were denied knowledge and understanding. 9 years later, at the beginning of this year, the OECD reported that British undergraduates were classified in literacy and numeracy as the worst of 23 developed nations. That damnation was a direct result of the strategist targets and tests introduced by Blair after '97. But to be fair, in 2002, Blair recognized the problem he'd created. To repair the damage, he returned to the Tory system of choice and competition, but it was too late. He'd abolished over 1,000 grant-maintained schools, but incidentally, he'd sent two of his children to one of those schools, and replaced them with 68 academies, whose results were overwhelmingly damned by Ofsted. At least 30% of children are still leaving school without basic skills. And pertinently, under Blair, education standards among the poorest children actually declined. And as Alan Milburn reported, social mobility in that decade actually got worse. You would not have known that truth from Blair's spin. Blairite statistics were massaged and exam results were inflated. The same deception concealed the government's immigration policy. Blair never told the electorate that he approved the entry of 500,000 immigrants a year. Those who dared to protest were called racists. The unchallengeable proof of all that dishonesty are the 120 civil servants I interviewed for the book, plus, of course, the dozens of Labour politicians and Blairites prepared to confess the truth. I believe we can rely on the identical credibility from the dozens of military officers and the most senior civil servants about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. 2 wars launched on the basis of lies. How could a mature democracy like Britain commit itself to fight those 2 wars on a false prospectus? Was Blair gripped by a god or a demon to so willfully ignore the predictions of disaster? No one predicted in '97 Blair's interest in war. After all, he'd even avoided the cadet force at school. Yet he turned Britain into a global troubleshooter, what he called a force for good. Convinced he could rid the world of tyrants, he never considered the consequences behind the headlines. The result was an undermanned, ill-equipped and underfunded and fatally misguided British army dispatched to fight the biggest wars since Korea, based on faulty intelligence, misjudged purposes, and from both they returned humiliated. That occurred because Blair excluded from his office experts who were critical. He acted on instinct rather than knowledge, and he acted in a conspiratorial secrecy because he knew his military ambitions in Iraq were illegal. Blair was not Bush's poodle. Ever since he joined Clinton in bombing Iraq in '98, he had wanted to topple Saddam. He always supported regime change. That desire intensified after 9/11, the Islamic attack on New York. Blair's problem was that an unprovoked war to topple Saddam was illegal under British law. So having secretly settled in November 2001 on that policy, 16 months before Iraq was invaded, he contrived a smokescreen to justify the invasion, namely Iraq's supposed possession of WMDs in defiance of the UN. Let's be clear about the lie. For 16 months, Blair told the British people that Iraq's WMDs posed a fatal threat forbidden by the UN. But his real intention was regime change. Whitehall's traditional machinery of government would have stopped that chicanery, but Blair's sofa government had deliberately dismantled the safeguards to halt his ambitions. To perpetuate the deception, he corrupted Whitehall's traditional decision-making machinery to avoid having to answer the difficult questions. Let's also be clear about another thing. Iraq was not an aberration. Misgovernment and deception were New Labour's tools for trade for health, education, immigration, and so much more. The concealment to lead the country into war was business as usual. To Blair's good fortune, Richard Dearlove, the head of MI6, confirmed that Saddam did possess WMDs. Dearlove's sources were fabricators and fantasists. The safeguard against those mistakes should have been John Scarlett, the chairman of the JIC. At first, Scarlett told Blair that MI6's intelligence was sporadic and patchy. But when Scarlett's dodgy dossier was published in September '02, that embarrassing honesty was omitted. With Scarlett's support, Blair assured the country that the intelligence about WMDs was extensive, detailed, and authoritative. How and why did Blair make that false statement? And why did no one stop him? I argue that Blair had fundamentally damaged the independence and quality of Britain's civil service, and the consequences remain to this day. Until July '02, 7 months after 9/11, Blair's intention to join Bush's invasion was known to very few in Downing Street. Those deliberately excluded were the Cabinet Secretary, the Defence Chief, and the Permanent Secretary of the Defence Ministry. To go to war without all their advice was unprecedented. Even in July '02, when Admiral Mike Boyce, the Chief of the Defence Staff, was not even then told that a decision had been taken. Nevertheless, Boyce warned Blair about the dangers. From that moment, he was regarded with suspicion. He told truth unto power. On the eve of war, Blair tried to fire Boyce. Afghanistan was the same. Intelligence was wrong, the army was undermanned, untrained, underfunded. 453 people died, hundreds have been maimed, and it cost Britain £38 billion for nothing. And the worse and worse, the damage to Britain's military was compounded. The army's plight today mirrors that of Britain's education institutions, the NHS, the judiciary, the city and parliament. So many British values have been tarnished by Blair, not least the absence of any shame of wrongdoers in public life. So in conclusion, Blair's decade did make a difference, but it was the wrong difference. He tapped the right sentiments, but betrayed the people's trust. Blairism was not an ideology, nor a set of principles. It was a concoction of intentions, dressed up in verbless prose, usually mentioning modernisation. But it was modernisation without meaning. Unlike Thatcherism, there is no Blairism. In the name of Britain, he fought wars to remove dictators, and now profits from serving dictators. Did Blair suddenly change after leaving Downing Street, or was he always a charlatan who concealed his true character through spin? In my opinion, he was an uneducated opportunist, whose decade was a missed opportunity, and the tragedy is a blight on Britain for the rest of our lives. Thank you very much.
Tom Bower, thank you very much indeed. Now the case for the defence. David Aaronovitch has 10 minutes and the 35 extra seconds that Tom took. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. The thing that I can see right in front of me says, "There shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more." But that's after this debate is finished. I can promise you quite a lot of pain during the course of this discussion. But first, let's try to think back to those terrible days when Tony Blair was in power and how awful it was, and how dreadful we felt in 2001 just before we gave him a second election victory, and how very bad we felt again in 2005 when we gave him a third election victory, and how dreadful MPs felt about the entire 10 years of Tony Blair's Prime Minister when, on his last Prime Minister's question time, at the end they broke into spontaneous applause from all sides of the chamber. And the question that I suppose we have to ask ourselves in relation to what Tom has said was, were they fooled by disaster into not realising that disaster was disaster? Somehow or other, the victims of an incredible contrick, which at that point had been going on for 15 years, because if that's true, and we were all fooled into this extraordinary contrick for those 14 years, then actually the people who should be on trial here is us and not Tony Blair. Or is there just a possibility, a third possibility, that Tom Bower has not considered, which is that in that 10 years, Tony Blair did quite a lot of things which were both necessary and good, and that many times and often the people of this country and members of Parliament and others, not just within the Labour Party, supported him for doing it. But that, with the advance of posterity, it has become really difficult for people to say so. I feel like Mark Antony a little bit here. After the killing of Caesar, it felt like beginning Friends, Britain's country persons, and reminding us that the evil that men do lives after them, whilst when Tom Bower's around, any good that they do will be interred with their bones. I've not had the time to read Tom's book that he had to write. In fact, I could only start looking at it on Thursday, so I couldn't get to grips with the case he was making, except for the excerpts in the Daily Mail, which I thought was an appropriate place for the serialisation. But to give you an illustration, so the question I wanted to ask myself before, we're trying to get to grips with it quickly, was, is it fair? Is it fair? So I did, firstly, a quick scoping exercise. You could argue that one of the signal achievements of the Blair administration was the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 and the subsequent events in Northern Ireland that brought to an end a conflict in which 3,500 British citizens had died over the years, including 800 British military. And to give you that kind of some kind of context, that is more than were died in Afghanistan and Iraq put together. Tom has 68 words on the Good Friday Agreement. 68 words. By contrast, he has 450 words on unsourced tittle-tattle about a supposed relationship between Blair and Rupert Murdoch's third wife, Wendy Deng. Now, I would put it to you as we go through that such an imbalance is not a product of an intention to try and balance the truth for you. There's also a certain kind of looseness in Tom's approach, which I found on page 13 when he was dealing with communication strategies. It's very early in the book. Quote, ensuring that Labour supporters in the media repeated the message had paved the way to victory. The most important ally being John Burt, the BBC's Director General, who had contributed to money to Blair's campaign to become party leader while still employed by the corporation. The only possible reason for having those two sentences in that proximity and in the same paragraph is to give the impression that John Burt, as Director General of the BBC or as a senior figure in the BBC, had lent on the journalists at the BBC to be favourable towards Blair. There's no evidence for that. There's no evidence for that at all. There was a footnote in the book. The footnotes are actually rather difficult to follow. to Anthony Seldon's book, which simply says that John Birt did make a contribution to Tony Blair's campaign as Labour leader back in 1994. But the suggestion is clear. And then, when the serialisation came out, that was, you could tell in a sense what the least favourable papers to Tony Blair wanted to make of what they thought Tom had done. And this was how the Mail headlined it. Conman Blair's cynical conspiracy to deceive the British people and let in 2 million migrants against the rules. Explosive new biography lays ex-PM's betrayal bare. Tom Bauer's new book, Broken Vows, Tony Blair, The Tragedy of Power, lays bare how the PM presided over a silent conspiracy to change face of the UK. Book reveals how Blair instructed ministers to wave tens of thousands of asylum seekers into the UK under the cover of there being economic migrants. Essentially, what Tom is saying is that there were a lot of asylum seekers, so what the government did was it decided that it thought that immigration was a good thing, but everybody else thought it was bad. So it would change the rules on immigration without telling anybody, so people would sneakily get in. And one of the ways that they would do that is that they would rebadge asylum seekers as economic migrants. This is rubbish. It is actually not possible, Tom, to do that. I talked to quite a few immigration experts and also to the man who was responsible for writing the paper that you say was effectively buried by Tony Blair. And this is what he said. Not only are the facts all wrong, not only have you missed out the fact that Barbara Roach's speech, the immigration minister, setting out a change in policy was well covered by the BBC, by the Telegraph and other papers, and even I mention it. Even I noticed it at the time, and so on. Not only did all that happen, but Tony Blair approved, contrary to what it says in your book, and read the part of the report upon which it was based, and approved the publication of the report, making that recommendation. That's contrary to what you have in your book. And I don't know on the basis of which, on what basis you managed to get it wrong, but I do know that it is a very peculiar government that decides to fool people that they're going to do something very quietly and behind their backs as a conspiracy, and does it by having a minister make a speech about it, which is covered in the media. But that's actually what happened. And there's a strange kind of bat squeak in Tom's book at this point, because what he says about Barbara Roach's speech was, few white Britons were ever aware of Roach's speech, but after hearing about her sentiments on the grapevine, migrants in Britain certainly grasped its importance. Well, Tom, I don't know what kind of Olympian capacity you have to talk to all white Britons and to all migrants, etc., but I have a feeling that Barbara Roach's speech was no more greatly discussed in the streets of Brixton than it was anywhere else. I mean, this is, frankly, a kind of moment when you say something with some kind of impact in mind. You then go on to say that Tony Blair did not care whether or not communities integrated, suggesting that almost any attempt to have a discussion about integrated communities was, in your words, racist. Actually, after the Oldham riots just before the 2001 general election, there were two reports commissioned, one of which was the Cantle report, which was issued in December 2001, had a very big impact on government, was spoken about by ministers, etc., and which does not even receive a mention in your book. There is no mention, despite all your talk about integration, etc., of the Cantle report post the Oldham riots, which is extraordinary. And I just use this as an example. I could talk a long time about Iraq, but I won't have the time, and I'm not going to, and so on. We'll maybe come on to matters of that later. This is an example, if you like, of skewing the argument about Tony Blair and Tony Blair's legacy. What you won't get in there kind of little things like the right to roam, the extension of the right to ramble, which was done by the government after 120 years of people trying to change legislation. You get one small sentence in which the term national minimum wage, I actually looked it up in the index. I looked first under minimum, nothing, and then under national, nothing, and then I looked under wage, and finally, on page 119, there were 8 words on the national minimum wage, introduced in 1998. In 1996, the Conservative prospective candidate for Stafford had said the minimum wage would send unemployment straight back. In 2005, David Cameron, who was that man, said, I think the minimum wage has been a success, yes. It turned out much better than many people expected, including the CBI. Tony Blair presided over, and that government, over a liberalisation of policy on things like gay rights against the opposition of the Conservative Party, both in the Lords and to a significant extent in the Commons. For instance, those opponents to lowering the gay, equalising the gay age of consent included such luminaries as David Davis, Nigel Evans, William Cash, John Redwood, Ian Duncan Smith, and so on. So no wonder they don't like the European Court of Human Rights. It's hardly surprising, because actually one of the early judgments of the ECHR in the late 90s was about equalising the gay right of consent. I haven't got much time. I could go on about Welsh devolution, Scottish devolution, the London mayor. I could go on about, and we will talk a bit more about what I think were, and we think were, the education achievements and the health achievements, the way in which we got away from the situation whereby when I first sent my children to primary school in London in the early 1990s before the Blair government, it was an open secret. In fact, it wasn't even a secret, it was well discussed, what an impossible situation London's education was in. And now we talk about the very opposite. It's private schools who have got the crisis and not the state schools which have got a crisis of... and the problem for state schools is their oversubscription. I'm going to say very finally, Tony Blair's big problem is that he can never be forgiven by two forces in British society. The Labour left and the Tory right, and for the same reason. He can't be forgiven for winning elections for the moderate centre-left. And the Daily Mail has never forgiven him for not actually being a Conservative and also for being a Liberal Prime Minister. A Prime Minister, I would suggest to you, that far from being a blight, for all his occasional wrong judgments and so on, actually left this country a much better place, as evidenced by the Olympics of 2012 than the country he found in 1997.
Thank you very much. Well, you've heard the case for the prosecution. You've heard the case for the defence. You'll get the chance to hear in a little while both of them having the chance to respond to some of the points that were made. But before we do that, what we want to do is hear from our expert witnesses. And our first witness I'm going to welcome is Professor Margaret Brown. Just to remind you who she is, she's the Emeritus Professor of Mathematics Education at King's College London. And Tom Bower, your witness. I'm afraid the time is short. It's 3 minutes for each witness. But there will be plenty of time afterwards to come back, and plenty of time for you, ladies and gentlemen, members of the jury, for you to interact with the people on the stage as well. Tom Bower.
Professor Brown, do you think Britain's education, do you think Tony Blair's education policy helped or hindered the education of Britain's children?
Right. Well, of course, he started with education as his high priority. We had education cubed rather than intelligence squared as the major aim of his government. And it wasn't long before we began to see things falling apart. And I guess it must have been extremely frustrating and very disappointing to see the results of some of that. First of all, there was panic in the DFE. I was originally involved with the numeracy strategy, and as you watch the results fail to go up, there was deep panic about what was going wrong. First of all, the screws were tightened. Teachers were told not only what to teach, when to teach it, how to teach it, exactly what content to cover in what lesson, but they then were told they were given lesson plans and told exactly what to say through each lesson. So we reached the state that we'd always laughed at France as having undergone, of the minister being able to say at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning, every year 4 child is learning the same thing. They tightened it up, they put pressures on teachers and children, and they eventually started throwing new ideas to try and get the results up. But try as they might, the international results were falling catastrophically, and the PISA results, both maths and English reading and also science, were all falling over the time. Not only the attainment results, but also the attitudes of children and of teachers were going down. There were 20% fewer children that felt that they enjoyed maths at the end of the period than at the beginning.
Professor Brown, I want to give Tom another chance to ask you another question, so if you don't mind.
Finish quickly.
Okay?
Yes, okay.
Tom?
Well, I think in
about
a
another
nutshell, you
minute?
said it very well, Professor Brown, that what Labour achieved was a minus, that the children in the end could not understand what they were learning. And what was the effect of that when they arrived in secondary school?
Well, there was some small gains made in certain places, but as soon as you got to secondary school, the cramming for the tests in the primary school put some of the results up, but the secondary school results didn't rise, so that you were getting the cramming for the test was disillusioning both children and teachers and not actually raising the results overall. This is also true, by the way, of the London results. I mean, London are way behind in the PISA results in spite of the London challenge. So that there was a disillusionment. And the whole reason was that they were throwing different ideas around. Some of them were actually inconsistent. And in the end, the money was thrown at the wrong things.
Professor Brown, thank you very much for being disciplined with the time. You'll get a chance to say some more. David Aaronovitch, your first witness is Matthew Taylor.
Thank you very much, Professor Brown. Matthew Taylor, you were at number 10 in the last part of the Tony Blair leadership and so on. How would you respond to what Margaret Brown has just said?
Well, I'd respond by saying that the LSE's authoritative account of Labour's record in office said that Labour met nearly all its educational attainment targets and reduced socioeconomic gaps between the poorest and the richest in every area of educational attainment. I would secondly point out that the IFS conclusion of Labour's government was that no government in recent history has made so much progress in relation to reducing pensioner poverty and in relation to reducing childhood poverty. I'd add that the effect of Labour's tax and spend policies over their entire term of office was highly redistributive. The fact that inequality was rising in the outside world was a challenge for all governments, but Labour's policies were redistributive, which is why inequality held steady in this country while it rose in others. So I think basically I'd offer some facts.
Now, also being on the inside of the final part of the Blair trajectory, what observations would you offer about that period?
Well, I think it's important to try to remember. It's not easy to remember, but to try to remember. And I want you to just think for one moment about this contrast. We have a Conservative government now that's just been elected. It's got a majority. It's in that honeymoon period where it's very, very strong. And what we're seeing is a Prime Minister who has gone around Europe in order to try to get some minor concessions in order to win a referendum, which he's only holding in order to pacify his own backbenchers. That's where we are now. I want to return to 2 days in July. Tony Blair has just won a third term, a very bruising campaign. These are the end years of his time in power. His power is diminished. He's got Gordon Brown snapping at his heels. On the first day of this 48-hour period, we win the Olympic bid. Can you imagine now a country with the confidence to bid to win the Olympics when at the beginning of that process we were the rank outsiders? Secondly, 7/7 occurred, the bombing occurred, which was a tragedy, but which I think the government responded to extremely effectively. People said it only happened because of Iraq. Well, you can ask the French about whether a policy on Iraq is what determines whether or not you're the subject of Islamic extremism, and Tony Blair started to do the things, unpopular though they were, which have protected us in many ways from being attacked again. And then the third thing that happened on the same day was the G8 agreement, the single biggest agreement to roll back poverty, to roll back debt in the third world, a major packet of help for Africa. Nobody thought it could be achieved, but again, Tony Blair said that he would do it. He had that obstinacy that Tom Bauer tells you about and says it was always a problem, and also an agreement to get the process of responding to climate change underway, a process which culminated in the Paris Agreement. So yes, Tony often thought he was right. Yes, Tony often ignored advice. And on many cases, thank goodness that he did.
Matthew Taylor, thank you very much indeed for being disciplined with the time. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So our third witness that we're going to hear from is Michael Clarke. As I told you before, he was Director General of the Royal United Services Institute until last year. Tom Bauer, your witness.
Michael Clarke, do you think that in launching wars against Iraq and Afghanistan, Tony Blair was actually acting in Britain's interest and honestly telling the British public what his agenda was?
I think he was confused in his own mind to begin with on Iraq, I don't know when he decided on regime change as the real objective. It certainly wasn't WMD, and it wasn't for the Americans either. Wolfowitz, Paul Wolfowitz in the States, has admitted that in his memoirs. He said WMD is what we united around. It was the one thing that united everybody, because America was quite disparate as well. I don't know when he decided on regime change, but he came to the conclusion in April 2002 at the Crawford meeting that the Americans are going to go, whatever happened. And in a sense, his assumption was, right, if the Americans go, we go with them, right or wrong. And that has been said by some senior civil servants. If the Americans are making a strategic blunder, we cannot allow them to make it alone. That's been said. So that was his basic idea. But then, in a sense, his sin is a sin of hubris, because he says, I, Tony Blair, will deliver the US to the UN to legitimize it. And that will bring the Europeans in. And then we'll start a new roadmap to peace in the Middle East. And we'll remake the Middle East on the basis of this. And I, Tony Blair, will bring all these elements together. It was huge arrogance and hubris. And the thing about that strategy is that it would fail unless it all worked, and in reality none of it worked. So we ended up on this rail track towards war, which we could not get off after April 2002.
Do you think that in the aftermath of Iraq, he learnt the lessons and applied them when it came to the second war in Afghanistan?
No. The decision to get involved in Afghanistan in 2006 was one of the least satisfactory decisions that the British system has made, because it was a pretty big decision, and it was almost made as an afterthought, partly because Afghanistan was going wrong between 2001 and 2003-04. It was getting frozen out by what was happening in Iraq, so nobody was giving enough thought to Afghanistan. And there was almost a sort of trivialization about what was going on. NATO agreed to go nation-building in Afghanistan. When I heard the NATO decision, the North Atlantic Council had made that decision, who the hell was there? Were they asleep that they're going to go nation-building in Afghanistan? Jeff Hoon was there, it turns out. I couldn't believe it. And it was a huge operation, a huge potential, taken on the basis of pretty poor intelligence and not very good understanding. And in a way, Iraq messed up Afghanistan, because the Iraq problem made it almost impossible to get the Afghanistan problem right. And we wasted 5 years in Afghanistan, so that by the time we recommitted in 2006, we had a much more difficult job to perform. It was very hard indeed.
Thank you very much indeed. And our final witness today is John McTurnan, who was Tony Blair's Director of Political Operations at the end of his time, 2005-2007. Your witness, David Aaronovitch.
John, you have quite a job to do, because in the first instance, I'm going to ask you to talk about the National Health Service. And the second instance, I'm going to ask you to respond to some of those points about Afghanistan and Iraq. So let's start with the Health Service.
Okay, on the National Health Service, what we heard from Tom was just misuse of facts. The spending on the NHS was not increased by 300%. It was increased to the European Union average. For Tom to be right, spending in Britain would have had to be 25% of the European Union average. It's blatantly obvious that what he said isn't true. There was a need for increased spending. Everybody knows that. In the early 90s, waiting lists in Britain were up to 7 years for some operations. By the time that Blair left office, they were down to 18 weeks. From diagnosis to treatment. That was a huge success. 100 new hospitals. Every A&E either refurbished or rebuilt completely. No junior doctor strikes. And we had an increase in taxation to fund all of that, which was willingly supported by the public in re-electing Tony Blair for his third time. The NHS, an unalloyed triumph. You only have to look around to what it's like now to realise how good the Blair years were.
And can we deal with, insofar as you possibly can, in a minute and a half, Afghanistan and Iraq? I mean, I think we should point out just for a moment that Tom misspoke himself. I don't think that his witness was disagreeing with the original decision to go into Afghanistan in 2001.
That's correct.
So let's leave that aside and go straight for...
Well, I think I do want to focus on what Tom said. Tom said that Afghanistan was launched on lies. It wasn't. It was launched by 9/11. We're in a treaty organization, NATO, which is a mutual self-defense treaty. America was attacked from ungoverned space by the Taliban in the ungoverned space of Afghanistan. We went to war in Afghanistan to rid that country of the rule of the Taliban. That was an unalloyed good. As we've got Iraq, let's talk about Iraq. The people of Kurdistan only have one question about Iraq, which is why did you wait so long? Genocide in the north in Halabja. The West did nothing. The going into Afghanistan, going into Iraq, was provoked absolutely by the unwillingness of Saddam Hussein, remember, to allow UN weapons inspectors to inspect whether or not he had weapons of mass destruction. That wasn't made up. That was a real thing. And Tony Blair took the decision to go to war to the House of Commons and set that precedent. So it's very hard to say that this was some secret thing that was done and smuggled through. There was a big open debate. And finally, I noticed that Tom doesn't want to talk about Kosovo and the Kosovans who were rescued by Britain and NATO bombing. He doesn't want to talk about Sierra Leone and the country that was saved by intervention. There is nothing wrong with being a force for good in the world. There is nothing wrong with the UK being a force for good in the world. And one of the great things about Tony Blair was he actually made this country proud to be a great country again.
John McTernan, thank you very much indeed. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, to all your witnesses. Now, I'm going to try something rather ambitious here, because there's a heck of a lot out there and there's a lot of people. But instead of a formal trial-like cross-examination, I'm going to try and pick up the themes that the witnesses have raised in the opening speeches and give us a few minutes on each to try and explore them. I will then announce the result of the pre-vote, and then, ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you the chance to make your points as well. You have to be as disciplined and impatient as these guys have been, which is jumping 1 minute from education to health to Iraq. But I think so far they're doing that really pretty spectacularly, so thank you for doing that. Let's begin, Tom Bauer, I think we should, because a direct challenge was made to you on the facts by David Aaronovitch, that you have simply got your facts wrong, most particularly on immigration, which nobody else has raised, which is something you describe as a secret policy, was publicly announced, and the change from asylum seekers to economic migrants that you claim happens is legally impossible.
Well, I think what David has done is it's a classic left Blairite tactic, which is to confuse, merge, distort, and then come up with a conclusion and accuse everyone of being either racist or wrong or whatever. The point is that within the book, I tell a story of 10 years. And if we're actually going to go to immigration, which I thought we'd agree we weren't going to talk about, but...
Well, just forgive me, the only reason I raised it is he says you got a specific fact wrong. Yes. Not the whole narrative, but a very important fact.
The point is that in 1997, Blair inherited a policy which, under the 1996 Immigration Act, rigidly controlled the number of people who could apply for asylum in Britain and also limited the number of people who could come from the subcontinent. In 1997, by the removal of the primary purpose rule and the relaxation of asylum seekers, let me finish, David. It opened the door. The figures show it. The statistics show it. They just went up. Now, how did that happen? It was by redefining the policy. And the redefinition of the policy was done by the civil servants with Jack Straw. It's all detailed in the book. It's all on the record from the civil servants' book. And it was done by them without announcing it to the public.
Very, very briefly, David, you're saying basically the primary purpose rule is not the same as changing from economic migrants.
Well, no, actually, the primary purpose rule has nothing to do with asylum seeking. Asylum seeking had gone up by 10 times between 1985 and the time that Tony Blair came to power. And so on, and been a significant problem. The primary purpose rule is a completely different thing. It's about the families, about people, migrants who had already come to Britain, in many cases actually become British. That's the point. The main point that Tom makes, however, is that there was a slimy, conspiratorial move that rebadged asylum seekers. He says this specifically as economic migrants. That is nonsense. It was impossible to do it, and indeed it wasn't done.
Briefly, Tom,
because that's exactly what David Blunkett told me he did, and that's exactly what happened. No. He did tell me.
No, you've misunderstood,
okay.
Tom. Let me tell Tom what he's misunderstood. No, what he's misunderstood was that it was perceived that if you made it very, very tight for people to come in as economic migrants, that some of them would try to come in as asylum seekers and add to your problem. And I think that's probably what he was talking about, and you misunderstood it.
Very briefly, both of you. Very briefly. Matthew Taylor.
I think we're being very unfair to Tom, actually. I understand why this is so difficult. If you have your business model for your book depends upon serializing it with the Daily Mail, you better put something juicy about migration in. And he's obviously gone to some great extent in order to be able to have something to put on the front page. I sympathise with you, Tom, and I hope that you got the fee that you were expecting.
Right. I challenged Tom on a fact. I'm now going to challenge David on a fact. Professor Brown was clear with the PISA scores that essentially literacy and numeracy were at their worst level for Britain, of 23, am I right, countries? Professor Brown. And therefore, does that single fact for graduates not trump all other claims about education
Absolutely
scores?
not. The PISA scores, which are one score, by the way, of attainment, are initially of 65 countries now raising to 70. So when we're 23rd in maths, or 24th in reading, or we go up to 20th in science, that's of 65 countries. And the main reason why we and other countries like us have come down the table is because the East Asians have gone up the table, including China Macau, China Hong Kong, China Shanghai, ranked as 3 different places, Chinese Taipei, etc., have all gone from nowhere to the top of the PISA scores.
Professor Brown.
It's not just the ranking. I mean, the ranking still goes down, even if you take the countries that were there the whole time. Maybe not in science, certainly in English and in reading and maths, in English and maths. But it's also true that our scores went down, and the scores are controlled across the different tests. So it wasn't just the rankings that went down, the scores went down too.
Margaret, would you seriously say to this
would
you seriously say to this audience that people's attitudes to state schooling in London are the same as they were 20 years ago? In 20 years ago, the attitude was of utter crisis in London schools, and now London is seen to be incredibly successful and an enormous number of outstanding. Are you saying there's no change?
I'm not saying there's no change in the schools, but I'm saying that the results actually haven't gone up, either in London or anywhere else.
But that's not true.
Some of the GCSE results might, but the level of children's understanding of subjects hasn't gone up.
So your measure, just so people are clear what you are and aren't saying.
That's right. The grades have slipped in order to make it look as though people's, I mean, it wasn't deliberate, I'm sure, but because the grading has slipped, it looks as though people's results have gone up, but actually children know less than they did at the beginning of the period.
So our old friend grade inflation is what
grade
you're
inflation is
blaming. Matthew Taylor has often been said. Have you an answer to that?
David, if I might hear, I remember that you said that in 1997, this is to quote you, there were more than 300,000 adults receiving help with literacy and numeracy, more than half attending further education colleges. That was a report that you yourself wrote about the situation that Tony Blair inherited. So you were describing, weren't you, a situation that was in considerable trouble at the point where Labour took over. Would you say that there were still 300,000 adults in need of help with literacy and numeracy?
Yes, we've just had an international OECD comparison, and our results were right at the bottom. I mean, for every age group, we're the only country where the results don't get better as people get younger. So right through the whole age group, we have more problems with both literacy and with numeracy than other countries.
And that's after 8 years of Conservative and coalition government as well?
Well, I'm not here to discuss Conservative governments. I'm here to discuss the Blair government.
That's a little bit of an evasion, really.
So I'm sorry, to take the Labour years, I mean, the latest one, okay, as it's been done during a coalition government, but that doesn't matter because the adults were educated earlier. I don't think there's any change.
Okay, very briefly, Matthew, if you don't want to do the NHS.
The point is, you can contest statistics. I quoted the LSE in an authoritative survey saying that Labour met its attainment targets and closed the gap overall. I think the important thing is to ask ourselves what our perception of state education was. And people who are who are over kind of 35 in this room will remember how state education was perceived in the mid-90s, crumbling schools, London in chaos, a very divisive system, and they look at the system now, and actually I think the Conservatives in many ways, in some ways, have continued the progress that Labour made to suggest that that arc, from where we started to where we are now, that there's been no improvement. I don't think it's just an insult to Tony Blair. I don't think it's fair to the children and the teachers of this country.
Quick reply from you, Professor Brown.
I think it's true that some things have improved. I mean, the control of the schools by head teachers has improved. But when did you last see a qualified maths teacher in a London school? I mean, I'm involved in a free school.
That's to do with housing policy. That's
okay.
No, I'm sorry, it's not entirely. The last government didn't take care of the teacher supply.
If we had affordable houses for teachers to live in London, we would have more maths teachers.
We're not here to debate affordable houses. We're here to debate Tony Blair. So thank you both. You've been, again, very disciplined. I'm whizzing through the NHS was the last of the domestic policies, I think it would be sensible. Tom Bower, it's been put to you, you got your facts wrong. You said that health spending had increased by 300%.
Right,
It had increased the EU average of 8% of GDP.
Yeah. John, in 1997, the NHS budget was 33.5 billion. In 2010, it was 115 billion. What's that?
Is that not a tripling?
You're doing cash to cash. You always do it in real terms. You've got to use it in real terms.
I'm talking about the NHS budget.
Are you talking about cash or are you talking
He's not talking in real terms.
I'm
He's
talking
not
about
comparing real terms budgets.
You see, this is the whole problem with arguing with Labour.
This is exactly your problem. You've got a problem
you must let me say something. This is the whole problem which the book cuts through. Every time one says something which is based on a fact, the government publishes a statistic saying the government spending on NHS, this is so simple, is 33.5 billion. And in 2010 is over 110 billion. There is no dispute about that, and yet the moment the Labour people and Blairites get a fact, they try and twist and turn it, so that, for example, now when Professor Brown eloquently explains the decline of maths education in Britain, Matthew immediately jumps to say, well, it's because of the housing problem. And this is the problem.
I didn't say that.
That whenever...
No, hold on.
Let me finish.
No, but you're lying, Tom. You're lying again. You can't stop it, can you? You're not actually capable of stopping it. I did not say, everyone's in this room, everybody's in this room. I did not say that the reason for the decline... No.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Briefly, Matthew.
Margaret made a point, and Margaret's point was there is a lack of qualified maths teachers in schools. There is a teacher shortage in London, and the primary reason for that teacher shortage in London is to do with the price of housing. I did not say that the price of housing in London accounts for Labour's record on mathematics. That is a distortion.
Let's go back. Distortion. Okay, he says it's a distortion, you say it isn't. Let's go back to the NHS and whether that is a distortion or not. Now, normally if I asked you your salary 10 years ago, you wouldn't say it had tripled. If inflation had gone up 20% a year, nobody measures anything that way, Tom Bower. So why, can I just ask you, why are you using cash figures? Nobody in this room would ever use cash figures.
Because that's the way the government presents. The way that Labour presented the increase in spending throughout their whole period in government
what they claimed it was tripling.
Well, no, this isn't the phony figures. This isn't the Gordon Brown tripling.
Can I just make a point here, Tom? The figure is clearly ludicrous because you don't allow for things like inflation and so on, let alone the inflation within the costs of the NHS itself. But you don't even make an allowance for an increase in population. Okay. So it becomes kind of a crazy thing. It's not 300% in real terms even. And when you allow for the factors of what the NHS has to cover, it's nothing like that.
Well, I mean, the population of England increased by 5 million over that period, just to put a little point there. There was inflation. But the real thing to remember is, during the last period of Tory government, there were winter crises in our hospitals. Flu overwhelmed A&E departments. There were patients on trolleys. Not in beds, in trolleys, in corridors. There were no winter flu crises under the Labour government because the money went to the hospitals, the money went to care, the waiting list.
I think Tom Bower's point in his speech, John, allow me, the point in his speech was not that there were no improvements in the NHS, but they were massively disproportionate to the investment.
And I'm explaining exactly what those improvements were and why they are linked to the increase in spending, increase in population, increase in spending, increase in inflation, and the outcomes were we have got in Britain, still have them because the current government keep to them, the best, shortest waiting in A&E times in the world.
John McTurnan, thank you very much. I'm sorry to push you, but time is always against us. Let's move on to that minor subject of war, shall we? That won't raise any emotions. That won't take any time to get through at all. Now, Tom Bower, you're not on trial, but Tony Blair is, but in a sense your claims are. You said that Tony Blair effectively faked the threat from WMD, and then in your speech you said, no, Sir Richard Dearlove had said this, WMD. Isn't that a problem with your argument? If the Prime Minister is advised, you may think it's bad advice, you may think it's wrong advice, you may even believe that Dearlove was lying. But how can you claim that Blair was lying and then in another sentence say, no, he was told to say this by Sir Richard Dearlove?
Well, fair enough, that's a good point. And let me answer it very quickly. If you dismantle the process of scrutinizing MI6's intelligence so that it is no longer subject to the rigor of testing it, you do it with one purpose only, because you're satisfied with what they're telling you. And Tony Blair was thrilled or satisfied with Dearlove's report that Saddam had WMDs. And what was critical about that report by Dearlove was that from 1998 onwards, the British JIC, the Joint Intelligence Committee, had said that Saddam did not have them. It was sporadic and patchy.
No, they did.
And yet, you must let someone finish, David.
They didn't do that.
David, let me finish, David. Then you can come in. The JIC summary in 95 didn't even mention WMDs in Iraq because they'd been destroyed in 1991. They didn't have them. That's the whole point. So why did Dearlove suddenly say they have them? And why did John Scarlett change the accurate judgment that the intelligence is sporadic and patchy, and they probably didn't have them, to suddenly say, allow Blair to say it's extensive, authoritative, and they definitely got them. And that was because, let me finish my sentence.
No, Nick's indicated that I should speak now.
Yeah.
So
Let
you're
David
now
come back.
interrupting me.
Yeah, David Aaronovitch.
The Butler report made it absolutely clear. And if you read the Butler report and the excerpts from the reports from the Joint Intelligence Committee, they do not say there was no WMD. They actually said that in their best judgment, and as far as they could tell, there probably was WMD and a WMD program. So I don't know why you said what you
Because
said.
simple now, let me answer that point. And that
What,
is
the point that what you're saying was actually wrong?
No, your point now about the Butler report. And this is absolutely gets to the heart of it. Robin Butler is well quoted in my book repeatedly. His words checked with him. His report was contaminated by a deal with Downing Street, which was brokered.
Let him finish his point.
Let me finish, David.
Yep.
Which was brokered by John Chilcot, and that'll give you the reason.
The deal
why
that did what? Just tell
to
the audience.
water down exactly what was said about WMDs. There couldn't have been a report.
So let me just be clear, because
He had
people
the
won't have
quotes,
heard
he
this,
had the
David.
quotes from the
Just-
Joint Intelligence Committee in the report.
Just quickly though, you are claiming, let's just be clear, you are claiming that Robin Butler, former Cabinet Secretary, deliberately changed the wording of his own report in a deal to do what?
What he did was he negotiated a form of words which satisfied Downing Street.
Okay.
And what David is making the mistake, which the media made at the time, is that the heart of Butler's findings are in the appendix, which neither you nor any of the media read because of the imposition of...
Let me bring in the expert witness. Let me bring in the expert witness, because Michael has not had a chance to say. I'll ask you about other things you want to say, Michael, but are you familiar with the argument that report was rigged? And do you believe it?
I don't know if it's true or not. I mean, I don't know if it was rigged or not. But the question of WMDs, it was entirely plausible that Saddam had WMD. He'd used them before. He'd used them on his own people.
Yep.
There were programs around. Nobody quite knew. And remember, intelligence reports are full of bits and pieces. That's the nature of intelligence. Bit of pillow talk, bit of gossip, bit of this, bit of that. And intelligence people always put the caveats in. They're full of caveats. If you ever see an intelligence report, it's nothing but caveats. And what was happening is that the caveats were just being airbrushed out. And these reports, which were actually pretty tentative, as they always would be, were being made to sound as if they were really quite definitive. And the danger, I mean, people used to say to me, what lesson should we learn about this? They said, don't do it again. Don't use intelligence as some sort of public opinion former.
The question I wanted to ask you is whether you agree with Tom Blair. Tom Blair says that he believes that Tony Blair made a decision 16 months out. I thought you were not saying that. You seem to say we don't know.
Well, I don't know if he made that decision so far out. I mean, maybe the Chilcot report will tell us. But what I do know is that he had decided by April 2002 that this was going to probably end up in war. Not inevitably, but probably. And once you say regime change is what we're after, then war becomes more likely.
John Burton, without getting bogged down in Butler or bogged down in timescales or bogged down in which summit it was, Crawford or whatever, it is clear, I was reporting at the time, we all knew, every news conference I went to from 2002, we were going to war with Iraq. We all knew it. He just didn't declare it as policy.
If that was
and you
true,
knew it, number 10.
No, if that was true, why would Tony Blair take a vote in the House of Commons which would determine whether Britain would go to war or not? It seems absurd.
Well, because then there was the momentum for it. It was very, very hard for the Commons to vote any other way. By the time you get to February 2003, you're going to bring the government down. You know. I agree. That House of Commons vote was not unimportant. It was constitutionally quite interesting. But it was like the nuclear option. If you lose the vote in the Commons at that point, then the government falls, Blair resigns, the thing gets even worse. So there's a great momentum. I mean, that vote was a bit pro forma, really.
No, the absolutely clear thing is that Tony Blair put this issue to the House of Commons and they were allowed to determine it. And, let's be clear as well, every other country in the world believed Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. They disagreed about what to do about them.
True.
They disagreed about what to do with them. And
just
finally, let's be absolute.
Let Tom come back on that specific. Tom, on the specific. What isn't true?
There are two. It's just not true. The Germans, the French. Joschka Fischer said to Rumsfeld, "We don't believe your intelligence." When they didn't believe it was the British government that made out that all these people believed in WMDs. But the fundamental issue is, John, there weren't any WMDs. There hadn't been any WMDs there since 1991. We know that.
Forgive me, Tom. The question was that's not. I'm sorry, that isn't the fundamental question. You're accusing the man of knowingly lying in advance.
Yes.
So forgive me, I'm going to ask a question.
Yes.
So, what we later knew has nothing to do with it.
Because
what matters is what was known at the time.
But that was
you're claiming he lied. It's a very, very big claim.
Yes. Yes,
and what we later learned doesn't prove that he lied. He may have done, but it doesn't prove it.
I tried it in my speech. It's very simple. The WMDs was the smoke screen.
Okay.
He used that, he always in favour of regime change since 1998 and definitely after 9/11. And the WMDs was the only legal reason he could go to war because that was in breach, allegedly, of UN resolutions.
Not only do I not believe it, but your leading witness, Michael Clark, doesn't believe that in 1998 he made a decision for regime change. It's completely wrong. Michael actually laid out very clearly what my understanding also is about what Tony Blair was trying to do. And the absolutely optimal situation that he wanted was that he wanted the weapons inspectors in and complete disarmament, which incidentally he thought would bring down Saddam, by diplomatic pressure. And as Michael quite rightly says, that was the strategy he was trying to follow that failed. Tom substitutes a strategy that fails with a story of conspiracy and lies, and Tom is wrong.
Briefly, I want to give Michael the chance. Michael's been quoted.
No, it's all right. No, that is my view. I don't know when Tony Blair decided on regime change or whether he only got it from the United States. But he certainly did believe that Saddam had to be brought down because he was an evil man. And he believed that it might have been done by peaceful means, but by just overwhelming pressure. But that overwhelming pressure was never likely to work, so it left us with only one option, which was to go with the Americans.
Don't worry, we've got time because the audience is going to ask you questions, and I have a sneaking feeling Iraq may come up. Just a sneaking feeling. But I tested Tom on his central claim. David, I want to finish by asking you on a central claim on Iraq. You have to argue, don't you, that he hadn't made up his mind. I say, quite when he made it up, doesn't really matter. Whether he had a vote, doesn't really matter. Clearly, you know, if he'd lost the vote, he would have. The truth is, we all know he'd made up his mind. You would have, if we'd met at that, I went to the Sedgefield News Conference in 2002, we all knew we were going to war with Iraq. Everything else was about how do you assemble the politics in order to justify it.
By November of 2002, I think it's probably right that it was alia jacta est, unless Blix came back and said they've given us absolutely everything we want, here it is, etc. It's over, done and dusted. And that
or if they got a second vote, vote in the UN.
Or they got a second vote, and that wasn't done by March 2003. It is certainly true that Tony Blair regarded the worst possible option as America, as no one taking action against Saddam, and the second worst as America acting on its own. And the question I would like to put, Michael, is very, very briefly this.
Really
do you think that George Bush would have invaded Iraq even if Britain had said we can't participate?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, absorb what that means.
Well, what does it mean? What does it mean?
It means that the Iraq invasion would have gone ahead anyway in even less propitious circumstances than it actually did.
Rumsfeld said that. He said there will be workarounds if we can't get any allies. So the US was always going to do something of that nature.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, I've deliberately allowed this section to overrun a little bit because I've sensed you were finding it engaging and interesting, so it's eaten into your time just a little bit. This is the moment where I have the gold envelope, except they're too mean to give me the gold envelope. This, and I have not read it, is the pre-vote. Then I'm going to invite you to put your hand up if you wish to ask a question. Can I be clear? This is question time, not speech time. Okay? So it's a question. It may have a point in it, but it's pithy. It isn't a brief summary of John Pilger's latest works, or indeed a brief summary of John Rentall's defence of Tony Blair. A question with a point. Sorry to be bossy. I'll take two at a time because we've got two microphones. Who's got a microphone? Can you wave them? I can't see you, but hopefully the audience can. Put your hands up now, and the people with microphones will go. I'm going to start, because I think it'd be clearer if we split this into international and domestic, with questions on foreign affairs, what we were just talking about. So questions on Iraq, Afghanistan, anything related, we're going to take now, and we'll come back to health and education, I promise. Here's the gold envelope moment. Ladies and gentlemen, drum roll. Before this debate, interesting. Just wish I could share it with you. I'm just rehearsing for a job at ITV, don't worry. Before the debate began, Tony Blair was a blight on Britain. 38% agreed, 29% disagreed, and 33% were undecided. Roughly a third, a third, a third. Interesting. Very interesting. We'll take your vote afterwards. So now is your chance to put your points. Who's got the first microphone?
I have.
Good.
My name's Jack Ben-Charter. As far as I can remember, Hans Splick, the UN weapons inspector, said categorically there were no WMDs, yet Blair went to war to depose Saddam and then thought that there could be imposed democracy in Iraq. A child of under 9 could have worked out there is no democracy in the Middle Eastern countries. It was a moronic thing to do.
Okay, thank you. Second microphone, forgive me because of the lights I can't quite see. Gentleman over there.
Can I please ask that the panel explain what this motion really means? We're told it's about a blight. What is a blight?
Okay, well, I'll tell you what. We'll do that briefly first, because it's a perfectly fair question, then we'll get back onto Iraq. While we're doing it, hands up if you still want to ask about foreign affairs, and if you would, with the microphones, catch them so we don't have any delay. Tom, we actually never did that, but just do it briefly, because we'll get back to Iraq. What did you mean by blight for the gentleman there?
Well, what I meant was that he corrupted the institutions of Britain and left Britain now in a state which was worse for what it could have been. It could have been infinitely better. And as the distortion, David talks about ramblers' rights, they talk about the Olympics. People waking up in Warrington tomorrow morning with a bad education, unable to get a job, or in a steel mill who are forced out of work because electricity prices are too high because of renewables and all that pricing, don't say, well, thank goodness there's ramblers' rights. They say Blair cast a blight over Britain, and the blight was their jobs and their livelihoods.
Matthew Taylor wants to respond.
I want to respond to the point that Tom has made repeatedly as his top comment, which is that Blair corrupted British institutions. I want to mention 4 British institutions which didn't exist and wouldn't exist without Tony Blair: the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, the Northern Irish Assembly, and the London Government. None of those institutions existed before Tony Blair. They'd all been fiercely resisted by previous governments. It was a result of Tony Blair, a man who handed more power away from Whitehall and Westminster than any Prime Minister in recent history.
Back to, we've established blight for you, I hope. We've established blight you briefly,
can I just
and then
say
let's get back
you will
to
notice
Hans Blix.
that in the list of things that I talked about, which did include ramblers, just to give you an idea of how wide it was, I also mentioned the Good Friday Agreement that brought the end to 30 years of killing in Northern Ireland, which, by Tom's own admission, was brokered by the genius of Tony Blair and what he did. And yet he hasn't chosen to mention it. As I say in his book, it gets 68 words. Yet he wants to talk to me about rambling.
Okay, let's go back to Hans Blix. We're going to Hans Blix. I tell you what, because Hans Blix was the first on Iraq, and I think we'll have a couple more, let's take the next 2. Yeah, one over here, lady at the back.
Thank you. Do you know, I've always been intrigued by we in the West expect a lot of countries that are tribal to actually have democracy. I don't actually think we should expect them to necessarily be democratic. Yeah. Going back briefly to the war, I am quite ashamed that Dr. David Kelly's name has not been mentioned tonight.
Just very briefly, because people are assuming they know what you mean, would you spell out what you mean? What do you mean about David Kelly?
Well, he was one of the world's leading experts of weapons of mass destruction.
Sure, but are you blaming his death on Tony Blair?
And he made his case very clear that there were no weapons of mass destruction.
Okay.
And there are 4 top doctors in this country at the moment. One was a coroner who thought his death was extremely suspect.
Fine.
And the government will not release the true facts for 70 years for fear of embarrassment to his family.
Thank you for your question. Where's the next microphone, please? Have you got the microphone, sir? We'll bring one to you in a second. Where's the next microphone? Let's take those while you find somebody else. Oh, no, here we are.
Hello.
Hello, sorry.
To your right.
Just down here, on the left, actually. On the left.
Blight is a pretty important word. It's a destruction of a harvest. I was wondering whether the panel and the main speakers would agree that the general public in Britain say a blight because A, Blair took us into a terrible war, and B, since standing down as Prime Minister, he's brought this country into shame by the way he's acted.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed for your questions. Yeah, let me take one at a time. We're going to focus on Iraq rather than blight, okay, and be different. Let's start with, if you'll forgive me, we're not going to do David Kelly's death. We will do, because no point, nobody knows the answer to that. We will do whether he did or didn't claim about WMDs. We'll do Blix and we'll do Tribe. Yeah. Okay?
And also will you do the post-prime ministerial thing?
Well, we're really here to put his time in office on trial. You can come back to that at the end.
But it's not Tom.
So let's stick with Iraq and let's stick with the war. Yeah. So first of all, Hans Blix, clear point made initially. Hans Blix said there were no WMDs. We went to war anyway.
Hans Blix said no such thing. Hans Blix simply did not categorically say there were no WMD. What he was able to say was that by the end of his inspection progress, which he hoped would have gone on longer, he had not managed to find any WMD. He told me when I interviewed him in 2007, specifically about an interview he'd had with Jacques Chirac, when he had said to Jacques Chirac, but Mr. Chirac, your own intelligence service says that Saddam has WMD. Chirac said, spies, he said, they intoxicate each other. So that makes the point about the French. On David Kelly, it's really interesting that you should say what you have about him not believing there was any WMD. As Tom actually fairly makes the point in his book, David Kelly, as you say, an absolutely world-class WMD expert, actually did believe that there were WMD in Iraq, and actually, had the level of WMD that he expected to find there been found, we would never, ever have had any of this argument.
Okay, Tom Blair?
Well, I'm going to keep it brief. The issue about Hans Blix is quite simple. Tony Blair, in his evidence at Chilcot, said it didn't matter about Hans Blix. As far as he was concerned, he wanted war and to remove Saddam. And whether Hans Blix stayed and found WMDs or not, and he knew by then that Blix kept on telling him there are no WMDs. He does say that in Chilcot. I've watched Tony Blair say it.
That Blix said that.
Okay, moving on. Ladies and gentlemen, you're hearing a little bit of rustling. Let me just tell you how we have to take the vote because it's physical and takes us a little bit of time to count as the debate goes on. So you've got a card. It says for and against. If you haven't got a card, when somebody comes around, ask them for one. For and against, really simple. If you still don't know, or you are now a don't know, put the whole thing in the box. That means undecided. Fairly obviously, if you do know, tear this in half, either put for or against in the box in order to vote, and as our discussion goes on, we will be collecting your votes, counting your votes, in order to not delay you at the end to give you the result. Is that clear? Everybody clear? Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. So, Michael Clark, on this issue of the WMD.
Yeah, just on Hans Blix point.
And David, ladies and gentlemen, a bit of quiet unless you're unclear about the voting. Okay? Shh. If you would.
Just on Hans Blick's point, the Americans played a very, I think, dishonourable role. They undermined Blix again and again and again. They attacked him all the time. And they kept saying, look, we know, look there, look there. And the UNSCOM inspectors kept going to where the Americans told them, and they still didn't find anything. So Blix ended up saying, we have not discovered anything. And the Americans said, well, you're an idiot. The fact is that the Iraqis, we knew they didn't have nuclear weapons because they'd been disarmed by Blix and the IAEA, we knew that. But the idea was, did they have chemical weapons because they'd used them before, etc., etc. And the belief was, the general belief was, that there were some chemical weapons, battlefield chemical weapons, which might have been available within 45 minutes. Nothing to do with us, that wouldn't threaten us, but there were weapons that might have been used on the battlefield. The final irony is that none of these things were found because the stocks had all been destroyed and nobody had told Saddam because they were frightened of him. And so when Iraqi generals were debriefed after the war, when they were captured, they all said, did you have chemical? No, no, they're not in my sector, but they were in the sector next door. They were always in the sector next door. Everyone was frightened to tell him the truth.
Michael, can I just check something here? There is an argument that Tom Blair has put, which is it was a lie from the beginning. There's an intermediate argument, and then there's one that no, it wasn't. There is an intermediate argument, which I sense you might believe, actually, and which is they simply ignored, Tony Blair and his advisors, any bit of inconvenient evidence. It wasn't a lie in the sense of saying from the beginning, we know this not to be true, but we will claim it is. But it's anybody who came along, whether it was Blix, whether it was the security services, whether it was the French or the Russians, you always discount what they say, argue against it on the grounds that you have pretty much made your mind up.
It was a sort of conspiracy of optimism and a conspiracy of momentum, and Blair believed in this momentum. We've got to exercise leadership. And remember, up until 2001, his leadership in foreign affairs has been pretty good because we said, you know, he conducted he presided over operations in Bosnia, in Macedonia, preventing a war, Sierra Leone, and Kosovo. All those things have gone right for him. Those are small operations. And his arrogance was that, oh, now we'll do this in a big operation with a country of 25 million people.
Michael,
that was the problem.
I think what you've said is fair, but I cannot accept the characterisation of Kosovo as a small operation. Kosovo as a small
country is what I mean. I mean, so now we're going to do it in a big country and remake a country of 25 million people with totally different cultures that are not even in Europe.
John Watson, let me just do one thing, and I will, I promise. If you ignore anybody who tells you what you don't want to hear and ignore all the evidence, may it not be possible that the net result becomes a lie? It wasn't what you set out to do, it may not be what you know, but the net result.
Yeah.
But
that is possible.
This chain of hypotheses depends upon the intelligence service going into this concocted plot to lie themselves to each other, to lie to Blair, so Blair could lie to the public. Occam's razor tells you that's not true. The simple truth is Tony Blair acted on the advice he got and in good faith. But I want to address the two people who cast doubt on the notion that people in the Middle East are able to have a democracy. Well, come with me to Kurdistan, where for more than 20 years, because of a no-fly zone imposed by the British and the US on Saddam initially, because of that no-fly zone, the Kurdish region of Iraq has had a parliament for more than 20 years. People in Muslim countries are perfectly capable of living without dictators and oppression. And the people in Baghdad queued at the risk of their lives from bombs, suicide bombs from terrorists. They queued and they queue and they queue, and they've done that for 5 elections.
Thank you.
So don't tell me those people in the Middle East don't want democracy.
See you, gentlemen, there. Have you got the microphone? I think you have, haven't you? Sorry, it's a bit hard for me to see with the lights. Gentleman here's got a microphone.
Yes. John Besford. Would anybody on the panel, including Mr. Aaronovitch, care to justify the bombing to smithereens of Serbia, which Mr. Blair supported?
Okay. We're going to take one more. Where's the other microphone, please?
Here.
Tell us
Hello?
where you are.
Up there.
Up there. In the gods.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My name is Sam Abdallah, and I just want to ask the panel, do you think that destabilization that happened in Iraq, for whatever reason, is actually partly, if not more, responsible on the refugee crisis that we are seeing now? Because the beginning of the destabilization in the Middle East started with Iraq going into a war with no prospect of how you rebuild the country, and therefore
and this ripples in the rest of the area, and we see what we're seeing now, massive number of people coming.
Thank you for your question. Let's begin with that, because our minds are on Iraq. We'll come back, I promise, to your question on Serbia. Crucial question, Michael Clark, as an expert witness rather than an advocate. Is what we're seeing now, was it all set in train by 2003, the invasion then?
No. It was made worse by it. 2003 and the fact that it went wrong created a vacuum which has made it worse. But the destabilization we're seeing now in the Middle East started on the 17th of December 2010 when a Tunisian market seller called Bouazizi set fire to himself in sheer anger at the fact that he couldn't sell his damn market stall stuff. And that went viral around the Middle East on social media, and that created what we now call the Arab Spring. And that had nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli dispute, nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, nothing to do with the superpowers. It just arose. And now we're in the second phase of that revolution, where the radicals get hold of it, and the vacuum that was created in Iraq has made it worse, but it didn't cause it.
I want to get on to domestic policy, so briefly, very briefly, and then we're going to do Serbia.
I just want to say that Syria represents the biggest failure of Western foreign policy, not Iraq, and it is amazing that there will not be a Chilcot into a process that actually has had much bigger ramifications demographically and every other way for this continent than ever Iraq did.
John McTurnan, do you want to... If the gentleman will forgive me, I'm not going to open up a whole debate about Serbia, but a brief answer to the question, how could you justify bombing to smithereens Serbia? His phrase.
The justification for action in the former Yugoslavian Republic is to protect citizens from the war there and from ethnic cleansing. I remember, and I'm sure people in the audience do, the shame of the 1990s when Britain and Europe stood aside and allowed ethnic cleansing to go on the continent of Europe. That's the justification what Tony Blair did. That's the justification which I think the public believe in.
Forgive me it being brief, but Professor... the professor has been extraordinarily patient while we discussed foreign policy, and we should also do some domestic policy. So if you've got the microphone now and you want to ask about Iraq, give it back. Sorry, I do want us to move on to health and education and then to our final statements and also our final vote as well. So again, forgive me, I can't see where the microphone is, but talk away and tell us where you are. Somebody at the back? Lovely. Thank you very much. Your question.
Thanks. So just say thank you to the panel for all their contributions. Very gratifying to hear about how better or worse your life has been from a panel of middle-aged straight white men. But thank you. So, anywho...
Well, you're making an assumption about their sexuality, and one of them is male.
Apologies. So I just wanted to talk about something that hasn't been covered so far.
It's the perfect moment for me to come out. Anyway,
the gay community would welcome you, Nick. So there's an unfortunate trend of governments to impose legislation to consolidate their power, increase the power and authority of public authorities or the police or whatever. You can see that in Conservative government bringing in the so-called Snoopers Charter. So there's two major bits of legislation that the Blair government brought in their first term, whose thrust was to grant powers to non-executive bodies or individuals to hold a government to account.
And those were, briefly?
The Human Rights Act and the Freedom of Information Act. Yeah. I just wondered if the panel could comment on those briefly.
Okay, thank you very much. Tom Bauer, you've been accused of ignoring things that put Tony Blair in a good light. I've no idea whether you did 35 words or 150 on the Human Rights Act or the Freedom of Information Act.
I think it was none, wasn't it?
But don't they matter? Don't they matter in the balance sheet?
David, can I just answer without you interrupting for 1 minute? Thank you. I do mention the Human Rights Act in great detail and the Freedom of Information Act. On the Freedom of Information Act, Blair was incandescently furious that he agreed to incorporate it and to legislate it and said I was a nincompoop and an idiot to do it. On the Human Rights Act, he constantly screamed at the Home Office officials, why on earth can't we get rid of all these bogus asylum seekers? And when he was told it was the Human Rights Act, he kept on saying, my God, we made a terrible mistake. That is the evidence of the civil servants who were in the office in number 10 and heard it. Let me just finish.
I hadn't said a thing. I'm allowed to change my body shape.
I sense it. I sense it coming. So Of course there were good things. Can I just explain one thing? The book
no,
is
that's quite important that you said,
one
of course,
sentence,
no, I'm
one
going to
sentence.
throw it. Of course, you say, forgive me, but you're accusing him of a thought crime. I mean, in other words, if he passed the act, you can't use that as evidence that he blighted Britain. He passed it. And then say that he didn't really mean to pass it.
But I didn't say
or he
blighted
regretted
Britain.
passing it. He did pass it.
What I can't understand about people when they criticise a book is that if they want to have things about Northern Ireland and freedom of exchange at great length, they should write a book about it.
Okay. They have.
Then they should. Then you read it. I wrote a book which is far too long, but I do
enough.
suggest you buy it because it's a really good read, which focuses on 5 areas. Let me finish. 5 areas.
You're never going to finish.
Go on, do your 5.
I'm not going to
5
start.
He's now touting his book, and Nick's letting him. He's complaining because I'm trying to get a word in.
Yeah, briefly, you're basically saying you were not trying to do the whole waterfront. You were doing the things on which you think he could be found guilty. Yeah. Yeah.
Which he should be judged on, not found guilty.
Okay, understood. And you listed
Right,
those
so
clearly. Matthew.
See, I've read the book, and it's well written, it's very entertaining. Well done. My concern about it is this. We live in a world where there is a high level of cynicism about government. There's a lot of apathy towards politicians. Being in government, running countries, is a very difficult thing to do. I often want to condemn this government and David Cameron and everything that they do, but having worked in Number 10, I know that the main reality of government is that it's very tough, it's very hard, and it's full of people trying to do the best they can in difficult circumstances. The reason I object to your book, Tom, is that I don't think it's a public service to write a book in order to entertain people by trying to portray a person and an entire government as being evil and wrong, when the truth is, as you well know, much more complex than that, and much more wicks than that. And actually people need to read about the truth, not just to read things that are entertaining and pander to their prejudices.
I should just remind you, this is not the trial of Tom Bower or of David Aaronovitch. It is the trial of Tony Blair. So let's take a couple more points. Again, forgive me, shout out one at the best. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think really we should have this divided between local policies and international policies. But however, if we get back to it, the prosecutors, 10 years later from now, if we are here talking about problems with education, National Health Service, are we still complaining and blaming Tony Blair?
Yes, okay. I suppose that was a point in a way directed at you, isn't
Yes.
it? Which is, of course,
Yeah.
not everything got marvellous. But
Well,
this is true of every government.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think all governments have a problem in education because educationists are seen as lefties, whether they're in schools or local authorities or universities. I mean, there were a lot of people who did know about education in 1997, and very few of them were consulted because there were a number of people around who thought they had this simple answer. And of course, you're right, education is very complex and it's not going to be easy to lift those standards. But I think one of the problems was that Blair wasn't looking in the right place.
Okay. Another... Okay, yes, there we are.
What effect can government actually have? What is the lag time between a policy being introduced and statistics for the children being literate or otherwise actually coming through?
And explain what may be underlying your question. Yeah. Do you think, in other words, there may have been improvements in the Blair period, but we haven't yet seen them?
There may have been improvements before they arrived and after he's been, but to actually specifically say one thing leads to another through a cross-slice of a statistic is probably a little dodgy.
Tom Bower.
Well, in a nutshell, what is very important to understand is that in 2001, the tests showed great improvements amongst children. And from 2001 onwards, they plateaued or went down. And none of the Labour people, the educationalists or Michael Barber, who's head of the delivery, could understand why. And the reason was, as Margaret Brown explained, is that the tests were fixed. The results were poor, and there had been an inheritance of good students from the Tory years. And so it was very easy to measure where the tests and everything were going wrong. And so you must let someone finish.
Yeah, okay, go on. Briefly, you're going to make your final things in a second.
The heart of this education argument, as it is on health and everything, is you can measure it very quickly. Productivity in the health service went down. It's measured by the King's Fund. The educational standards went down because it's measured by endless numbers of universities who did crunch the numbers of the tests of the children. And they saw the deterioration. And that was all caused by Tony Blair's government, and that is the blight.
Thank you
and
very much.
One sentence finish. I do object to one thing about this whole argument, where Matthew says, I want the truth. There is no such thing as the left no and the right no, as the truth. There's an opinion. There's an interpretation. There is a judgment based on a set of facts which themselves are subject to. So you shouldn't actually accuse me of distorting the truth, because I didn't. What I did was I took facts and I interpreted them, just like you did through your spin machine and Alistair Campbell and your dodgy dossier and all the rest. You presented truth. You presented truths which were false, and we all suffer for that today. And I just don't take it kindly that you say that what my book contains is not the truth.
Okay. I think, to be fair, Matthew, you had a pop at him, he's had a pop at you, so rather than inviting you to have another pop at him...
Can I comment on the question about statistics?
You can briefly do that, and then I do want to bring us to the close, to our closing statements, and to our final votes. Yes, on the statistics, if you would, rather than on Tom's point.
It's very difficult. The point's very well made. It's extremely difficult to disentangle those effects, which is why I think you have to look for big things that are incontrovertible. And if I had to pick out one incontrovertible statistic, it would be that Labour reduced child poverty by 500,000. And actually, experts on child poverty the world round say that no government has managed to make such an impact in reducing child poverty. So you're right, when it comes to small subtleties, the kind of things we're arguing about, very difficult, there are certain big things that are incontrovertible.
And a last word to Professor Brown.
Right. I think that there is a problem because often the tests aren't the same tests. And, so actually to compare standards is very difficult because you get slippage of standards or you get different tests. But actually, in 2 cases, we have results from the same schools before and after the numeracy strategy. And they show a very small change in this is primary schools. There is a small improvement, but a third of the schools had worse results after the numeracy strategy than they had before it. And those are exactly the same schools with the same intakes 5 years apart, 2 years before, 2 years after. We also know that in those schools there was a greater split between the top and the bottom. So this notion that the gap was closed in those schools, the gap had opened even further.
Thank you for your patience, Professor Brown. Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the closing statements. They've agreed to sit, though,
of course.
To be calm.
Of course.
David Aaronovitch is going to go first and make the case for the defence of Tony Blair on the grounds that he does not believe he was a blight on Britain.
You've already voted, so what I'm going to say is either too late or I can now afford to be offensive. Or even more offensive than you might consider I have already been. I always enjoy debates like this, and it's very interesting sometimes to listen to what gets applauded and what doesn't. The motion was that Tony Blair was a blight. My suggestion to you was that if you took the thing in the round and looked at all the things that his government had done and had achieved, it would be very difficult, fairly, to come to the idea that he was a blight. I think we've shown that some of the things that Tom has said, things like that the immigration statistics were effectively fixed and fiddled by conspiracy, or that there was a conspiracy to get into war, a position which has actually been undermined by his own key witness. And even on the question of things like educational attainment, you can see that there is a really significant amount of discussion about what that means. And I take the point that the gentleman made about the time lag of governments. Tom Bower essentially has presented to you a cartoon version whereby the rather wonderful Britain of 1997 comes out in 2007 corrupted, unrecognisable as itself, with a government that has achieved absolutely nothing of any real value or nothing that he can be bothered to write about or suggest. And all I'm saying to you is that's not the case. That in many ways Tony Blair was a very good Prime Minister for this country, and although he, of course, and his government and his successors make mistakes, Matthew Taylor's approximation is right. Governing is a complex and difficult business, and by and large the reason why Tony Blair won 3 elections and won that standing ovation in Parliament on the date that he went was that people thought that on balance He had been a good Prime Minister, and Britain was better for having had him there.
David Aaronovitch, thank you very much. And a closing statement for the prosecution, Tom Bower arguing that Tony Blair was a blight on Britain.
Tony Blair won 3 elections because he faced an extraordinarily weak opposition. Even after the Iraq War, the Tories were in a terrible state under Ian Duncan Smith, and there was no chance that they could win the 2005 election. He did not win because he was a marvellous Prime Minister after 2001. I chose 5 areas which I think encapsulate the most important aspect of government: health, education, immigration, energy, and the wars. And on all of those issues, Tony Blair failed remarkably. Forget the rambling. Ireland is a completely different story. There's a huge army of people who were working for that peace. MI6, stranger, was extraordinarily successful in undermining the IRA. That is not part of the legacy of Tony Blair on our lives today. Our lives today are all about an economy which was bust in 2008. It's all about a housing shortage because less houses were built during the Labour period than before. It's about an education system which was in crisis, with more people in Blair's era going to private schools than ever before. And it was a period when, under Blair, with renewables, the energy prices so soared that they're closing down steel mills in Labour areas in South Wales and elsewhere because the price of electricity is so high because Blair forced it to go so high. It was a catastrophic government because he didn't crunch detail and he didn't actually understand the heart of government. And what you see on the platform tonight are 3 remarkably good people. They believe in the spirit of Blair. They believe he did good things. And the great tragedy for these people, as the tragedy is for Blair, which is the subtitle of my book, is they don't understand what they experience. They don't know what they lived through. And if only they'd read the book without their prejudices, they would begin to understand. They'd see the light. And surely in this building, we want them to see the light.
Tom Bower, thank you very much indeed. Just before I thank you all and thank our panellists, here it is. First of all, let me remind you what the vote was before the debate. Those who believe that Tony Blair was a blight on Britain, 38%. After the debate, 64%. Those before the debate who believed he was not a blight on Britain, 29%. After the debate, also gone up, but much less, 33%. So the real story of tonight's debate is the undecideds. Before the debate, 33%. After the debate, 3%. A swing in favour of Tony Blair being guilty in this trial of being a blight on Britain of plus 11%. It only remains, just before you leave, ladies and gentlemen, for me to thank, as I know you will want to thank, first of all yourselves for your excellent questions, David Aaronovitch, Tom Bower, John McTurnan, Matthew Taylor, Michael Clark, and Professor Margaret Brown. And of course, Intelligence Squared for organising this excellent event. Thank you very much indeed for coming. Safe journey home. Do come to the next one.